So the book, The Personal Librarian, has brought a lot of attention to the story of Belle da Costa Greene, who is the woman you see here on the screen. And the Morgan has been really excited about all of the interest. But here's the thing, the book is historical fiction. And I've had amazing conversation with the authors, and a lot of it is made up. They change names, they change dates, they change locations. And so I'm here to just tell you how she really was. But here's also one of the kind of hard things about studying a woman like Belle da Costa Greene. She is an African-American woman who was born in the 1800s, lived through the early 20th century. And African-American women's history, much like the larger women's history, is often not kept the same. It's going through scattered archives. It's looking for information in places you don't normally look for information. And so one of my very first jobs at the Morgan, in order to help build this exhibition, was to look at her professional papers, which we've learned are much more personal than professional, that we have at the library. And we found this vibrant, amazing woman that in between receipts for how much it costs for typewriter ink, or how often we clean the polar skin rug. Yes, we had a polar bear skin rug in the West Room for a while. And we found this really amazing, rich woman that we have realized we have to dig into her story in different ways in order to complete a much larger picture of who she was. And I always start any talk I give with this quote, which is she's actually writing to a sports writer from a New York newspaper who is giving a talk at the Morgan. And then she says that she doesn't dote on libraries, but she does on this one, meeting the Morgans. And she often had a way of saying my library, even though she would always correct herself and say, no, I mean the Morgan's library. But at the end of the day, we kind of all know it was her library. And so this is her birth certificate from the DC archives. And this is where the story of Belle da Costa Greene really starts, but not in a historical timeline. It was a woman by the name of Jean Strauss who in the 1980s and early 90s was working on the biography of J.P. Morgan, who said, as she's digging on all this research, she's like, I can't do the story of Morgan's library without talking about Belle da Costa Greene. I mean, she ran this building, like I have to talk about her. And as any good biographer and researcher, she's like, well, I need to confirm her birth date. Because at the time we thought her birth date was I think she gave it as like 1884, 1885. And so she just started digging through our archives. She went to Virginia first, because Greene had said she was born in Alexandria, Virginia, and of course there was nothing there. And through just plain old historical research, she went to the DC archives and she found Belle da Costa Greene's birth certificate and found out that she was actually born Belle Marion Greener in Washington, D.C. in 1879 to Richard T. Greener and Genevieve Ida Fleet. And then probably the biggest surprise to most people was that she was actually an African-American woman, which was gossiped about during most of her life, but had never been officially declared until this birth certificate was made public record when Jean Strauss published an article in the New Yorker in 1999. So I just always like to give Jean credit. She is an amazing woman who very much is very proud that she's like, well, of course I went looking for the birth certificate. But then that gets us to, okay, so who is Belle Marion Greener? And so I always start her story not with her father, who is very well known, and we will get to him, but actually with her mother, a woman by the name of Genevieve Ida Fleet Greener, who was born in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. in 1849. And so this is just a map of D.C. kind of around the time when she was born. And I have actually had the opportunity of going down to Washington, getting a really great tour of Georgetown. And that front door is the front door to the Fleet residence, where Genevieve was born. It is now a kind of office space for somebody who really likes the Chicago Cubs, because you walk in and it's just like all Chicago Cubs stuff. But because it is a townhouse that is on the Historic Landmarks Registry, they have not been allowed to change the inside, so the structure is essentially the same. And so as we were doing our research for the exhibition, we were like, well, who is Genevieve? She lived her entire life with, Belle, and who was she? And we realized that she is actually an amazing woman who comes from an amazing family. The Fleet family has deep roots in the Washington, D.C., in the free Black community, going back to her great-great-grandfather, who actually purchased the freedom of his other family members in order to bring them into freedom in the 1820s. And they lived in Georgetown, D.C., and we have here a census record that shows Genevieve and her brothers, who I always like to mention because their names are Bellini, Mozart, Mendelssohn. There's very much a music thing going on here. And so her great-grandfather actually was wanted to be a doctor, and had actually gotten a scholarship to go to Columbia Medical School, which is at Georgetown University, but it was funded by the Colonization Society. And there was a kind of stipulation that, okay, we'll pay for your medical degree, but you have to move to Liberia in order to practice. And he's like, y'all are crazy, we need doctors here. He's like, I'm not gonna do that. So instead, he opens up a music school and then a high school in Washington, D.C. He's like, y'all can keep your money, I don't need it. And so right from the jump, we realized that there is the power of education and knowledge and learning is deep within this family, but also the fight for the right for this education started with James Fleet and continued on with his children, and then on to the next generation, which included Genevieve, who was actually a music teacher herself, a principal of a school in D.C., and really just an incredible woman who was known as a Washington Belle when she went up to Boston one summer, which is where she met Richard T. Greener. And Richard T. Greener is the first African-American to graduate from Harvard College. He was born in 1844 in Philadelphia, and would move to Boston as a child, and he would he got into a kind of apprenticeship position where he got to be in a gentleman's library, work within there, and he grew his love of books. And so he attended Harvard from 1865 to 1870. And so this is his diploma here on the screen. And you notice those watermarks that are on that diploma? It's actually a really interesting story. The diploma, he thought he lost his diploma in the earthquake in San Francisco in 1960, thank you. I never remember that one. So he didn't know where it is. And then somehow, though, he says he doesn't know where it is, but it shows up in Chicago. And in the 90s, somebody's working on a house and finds this chest. And inside is Richard T. Greener's diploma, pictures, all of these information, which is just kind of incredible. And that's where Richard T. Greener's story kind of gained popularity, was with the discovery of these items in Chicago, which was his last residence, before he died. And so while he's at Harvard and in Boston, he goes to this event. It's covered in the newspapers. It's probably, this big soiree some summer, and that's where he meets Genevieve. And so eventually he moves himself down to Washington, D.C., and and the two of them court, and they get married in 1874. And at this time, he takes a job at the University of South Carolina, where he's also going to get his law degree. He teaches some courses, and most importantly, he is a librarian. So this is where we get the library angle in there. And so this is actually the home that Richard T. Greener and Genevieve lived in the University of South Carolina. It's called the Third Professor's House, but before Richard T. Greener lived in this house, this is the home that the University of South Carolina used to house the enslaved that worked on the campus at University of South Carolina. And that is where they put Richard T. Greener when him and his wife moved down from Washington, D.C. That did not stop him from doing everything he knew he could do, and for pursuing his goals. but unfortunately, with the fall of Reconstruction in 1877, University of South Carolina went back to a strict policy of having not only no African-American faculty, but no African-American staff or students. And so him and Genevieve would move back to Washington, D.C., where they would begin their family. And so they resettled back into life in Washington, D.C. In the late 1870s. And Richard has to now learn, kind of migrate within Genevieve's universe. So like I said, Genevieve was from Washington, D.C., but she came from this elite family who was well known in the community, had a lot of wealth. And we know a lot of that through the fact that they attended the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which you see here on the screen. That is a photo, that is no longer what the church looks like. Unfortunately, in the early 1900s, it suffered a fire, so they had to reconstruct the building. They lost a lot of their documents, but thankfully they had transcribed them, and copies of them remain today at the Moreland Strickland Special Collections at Howard University. And on those rolls, we do know that Genevieve had become a member of the church in the 1860s, back when the abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett was a minister. And then when Richard and Genevieve moved back to Washington, D.C., the church is now run by the famous abolitionist and activist Francis J. Grimke. And I always point this out because, unfortunately, what Grimke brought to the 15th Street Presbyterian Church was a practice of colorism. You had to be light-skinned in order to be a member of this congregation. So that's how we also know, without any photos of Genevieve, we can anticipate what Genevieve might have looked like. Other members of the church included many of the first Reconstruction senators, such as Blanche K. Bruce, were active members of the church. And actually, not part of the colorism is they admitted, and they're unfortunately the notes from the church actually kind of say they made a willing exception for Mary Todd Lincoln seamstress Elizabeth Keckley to be a member of the congregation, even though she was of a darker color. And so that entry is very powerful when we see how the church operated. But we think that it's at the church where Genevieve might have begun to kind of look at life in a different way than maybe her husband would have looked at it, plus their time at the University of South Carolina and the issues they would have to go through, we kind of believe might have put her mind in a thinking that we will get to in a little while. But the 15th Street Presbyterian Church is also the only place where we get one of the very few pieces of evidence of the life of Genevieve. There's very little outside of census records or newspaper reports about her, but on this pamphlet we see her on the screen, she's the second name listed as being one of the women leaders of this congregation, which is how we also know she held a powerful spot in this church as a leader of the community, which says a lot about who she was and her active role in this elite African-American community in D.C. And so in 1879, Belle Marion Greener is born into this community. She is baptized at the 15th Street Presbyterian Church along with all of her siblings. And they live on T Street in Washington, D.C., which is about 3 blocks from Harvard. I've walked it. It's not a very far walk. Not Harvard, sorry, that's where Richard went. Howard, sorry about that. Both H's. Where at this time, Richard T. Greener was dean of the law school at Howard University. And so they were just kind of living life until 1885, when he decides to take a position on the Grants Monument Association project, which was to build essentially the tomb for Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, in Washington, D.C. Not in Washington, D.C., sorry, in New York City. And so he will move to New York City. That is an original, the original temporary tomb. It's not what it looks like now on Riverside Avenue. And so he will move, and then eventually the family will join him after the younger Greener child, Theodora, has been baptized in the church, and the rest of the family will move with him. by 1887, and that photo there is of the street on West 58th Street in New York City, which is where the family would take up residence. The children went to school 2 blocks over, and they just kind of kept living their life. Unfortunately, Greener was gone most of the time once the family moved there. He held many different kind of other jobs while he was working on the Grants Monument Tomb project. He unfortunately lost some money in the gold rush. And so we have there's these wonderful letters actually at Howard with his cousin Isaiah where he's like reporting on, oh, Jenny wrote me and the kids are doing this in school, or oh no, Russell, the son, had this sickness, and Mary Louisa, who's the oldest daughter, is practicing her piano, and just kind of getting the daily updates from Genevieve about how the kids are doing. And so it becomes very clear that Genevieve is the one doing the real raising of these children, giving them their education and their knowledge. Excuse me. And so this relationship is unfortunately not going so well. And by 1894, the couple has split. Richard has left New York City. And it's up to Genevieve to really kind of take the reins and move this family forward. At this time, Belle Marion Greener is working at Teachers College as a secretary in order to bring some income into the household. And she gets admitted into Northfield Academy, which is a school in Massachusetts. And we actually have here her application for entering the school, where she actually says she wants to be fit to be a librarian. So it's the first instance where she has that she wants to be a librarian, probably in the footsteps of her father, who was one at the University of South Carolina. And so she'll be admitted there in 1896. And so we kind of see that we know that she had already begun Latin training. She marked preferences mathematics and language. So the materials at Northfield really gave us insight on who was Belle Greene around the age of 17 when she enters this school, which Northfield is an interesting school because it follows in line with the tradition of what comes out of, in the early 1800s, female seminaries that believed women didn't need to just learn sewing or household chores, that they had a right to an equal education, and should learn things like math and Latin and science. Crazy, I know. And so Northfield was known for teaching this kind of education, but was also admitted anyone who met certain qualifications, but they did not. They admitted African Americans, they admitted indigenous, Asian Americans, so they really were kind of innovative at the time when Belle Greene would have been attending this institution. And so how does she get to go to what is essentially a private school in Massachusetts? And it's through the philanthropist Grace Dodge. We're really not sure how Grace Dodge met the Greener family, but what we do know is that when she writes a letter of recommendation for Belle Marion Greener to go to Northfield, she knows exactly who Belle's father is. She says her father is Richard T. Greener, but she believes that Genevieve is white. And so it's through these letters that we do know that it is Genevieve who begins passing for white before any of the children. And we do know that it happens after Richard leaves the family. Unfortunately, we do have no archival evidence of her decision to begin passing, besides America in the late 1800s, is America. And it was, if you could pass for a white, your opportunities were expanded. And so, excuse me. And so it's these letters that really begin to give us wonder. And remember how I said that she went to a church that was very colorist. And so we wonder how much of that influence, when she did begin to pass for white, how much that influenced, how much that influenced her decisions moving forward. Again, we don't know, and I'm not one to speculate because I have no idea what it was like to live at a time when you are seeing more and more lynchings, when you are told you have to sit in the back of the train car, when you were told you can't go into a store. I couldn't even begin to understand that, and so I do not like to pass judgment on somebody's decision of why they would have chosen that decision, but it's kind of, we all kind of understand where somebody's mind might go. And so after Northfield, Greene will attend Amherst College for what was then considered library school, which I'm always so jealous that she got to go to school for a summer, and I had to do 2 years of training. And so this photo actually just was, we randomly talked to the archivist at Amherst like a year ago, and we're like, hey, somebody said there might be some photo, and he's like, he sends us one photo, and we're like, no, she's not in that. He's like, well, what about this photo? And so this photo is only like a year and a half, like, I mean, everybody at Amherst knew it was there, but to the world, we're all like, oh my gosh, there's this photo of her. So this is the earliest known photo of Belle. At this time, she is still going by Belle Marion, not Greener, Greene. But sometime between Northfield and now, the family has dropped Greener to kind of disassociate from Richard and has just taken on the last name Greene. And by the time Belle gets to Amherst, her mother has become Genevieve, instead of Genevieve Ida Fleet, she is Genevieve Van Vliet, to kind of go on with the identity of a white woman, possibly of Dutch origins, which would make sense in New York City. This quote, which is from Greene in 1916, we just love this because she's like, before I was 16, I had begun my studies. And she kind of like is talking about her love of books and wanting to work with rare books. And so we kind of like, well, of course she went to library school. Like, I mean, hello. I mean, her father was Richard T. Greener. Her mother was an educator, a musician. Like, it kind of all really makes sense. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water. And so she is around the age of 21 here when she will go to this library school. And then after she leaves library school, we do know that the head of the program at this time was very close friends with the head of the library program at Princeton. We don't know if this is how she got the job, but we assume that it's through this connection that she begins her library career at Princeton University, where she works at the Chancellor Green Library, which is on this side of the screen, and she works in the cataloging room, which is over there on the other side. And so we know that, like, we've actually just an amazing researcher at Princeton, eagle-eyed. They're looking at the early accession books, I mean, I want to say not even a year ago, and they're like, I think this might be Belle Greene's handwriting. So they call us up, we go down to Princeton, and sure enough, we're like, oh my God, that's Belle Greene's handwriting. So we know she was cataloging full collections of books around 1903 at Princeton University, doing this kind of cataloging work. And it's while she's doing this that she meets the honorary librarian, because he was spending a lot of time in Europe, this gentleman here in the middle, Junius Spencer Morgan, who is just a very interesting young man who has a huge Virgil collection, which he gifts to Princeton University, which he had went to. And he kind of not takes Greene under his wing, but you know, anytime she wants to see an illuminated manuscript, he's like, yeah, come on, I'll show you it, like, you know. It really starts to foster and continue that love of rare books that she already has. And so it's through Junius Spencer Morgan, who at this time is really trying to move away to Europe. And he's constantly being brought back by his needy uncle who needs him all the time to work on his collecting. And he's like, I don't want to help my uncle with his collection. I want to do my own. But who is this uncle? The famous J. Pierpont Morgan. And so he's like, I need to do something about this, which we will get to in a second. But Greene's time at Princeton is really very interesting from the fact of what Princeton University represents in the early 1900s. Princeton is often referred to as the Southern Ivy. Most of former Confederate soldiers, especially of the elite class, would send their sons to Princeton for their education. They had a very strict policy of no African Americans on campus. And so it's really the first time where we believe that Greene passed as white. It is also her time at Princeton where we see her name change from Belle Marion Greene to Belle da Costa Greene. We have no evidence of why they chose da Costa. Not all of the children add that to their name. It is only her and her brother Russell. Some have speculated that it's because they were the two darkest of the children and that they wanted to allude to some kind of heritage that would explain the darker skin color. And we just kind of use these photos. They're not taken from the period of when she was at Princeton. We don't have any photos, but it's very interesting to kind of think of Greene having a conversation with herself about how do I navigate a campus that says I should not be here when I am clearly, and she would say it, killing it, being amazing, working in this field. And it's the first time we have on census records her saying her name as Belle da Costa Greene. She's working as a librarian. And so it's an interesting time. While she's at Princeton, the new president of the university starts, and that would be a gentleman by the name of Woodrow Wilson. She has dinner at Woodrow Wilson's home on campus, which I always am kind of like, what was that conversation like? But Greene very much knew how to hold herself around a kind of upper crust people. Remember, she's coming from a community in Washington, D.C. She was coming from an elite community. She knew how to speak with senators from when she was a child. And so kind of moving within these circles was in her wheelhouse. The biggest thing she had to overcome was her skin color. And unfortunately, as we will talk about as we continue to go through, we have no writings whatsoever on her thought process while she's navigating these waters, which is really just, we kind of always wish there was, but it's not there. And so when she leaves Princeton, like I said, there we go. Junius is having a problem with his uncle, J.P. Morgan, who is that gentleman over there in the famous Steichen photo of him. J.P. Morgan is a financier, banker, ran U.S. Steel, huge conglomerate, and he's getting older in life, and he's kind of focused his attention less from his banking work and more to his hobbies, which was collecting. He started collecting out printed books of his favorite English authors, such as Charles Dickens, some illuminated manuscripts. He dealt with antiquities. He kind of floated his fancy. He just threw his money at and brought it to his home, put it in the basement, and his wife was like, I want my basement back. What you doing? Like, this is my home. We have kids. Why? And so he moves some of the collection up to what is now the Frick Museum, but was then the Lenox branch of the New York Public Library. And he decides around 1902, 1903, well, there's this plot of land next to my brownstone. I'm going to build a library, and I can house all my stuff in there. And so McKim, Mead, and White is the firm that, these are the architectural plans from 1902, to build his private library. And so once construction is underway is when Junius is like kind of saying to him, hey, you're gonna need somebody to work with your collection. It's massive. You can't just put it all in the building and look away from it. Like, that doesn't work. And so he brings Belle Greene up from Princeton and is like, hey, interview. I think this will be a good fit. We don't know anything about how that interview went, except obviously it must have went well, because by the summer of 1905, Belle Greene is working for J.P. Morgan as his librarian in what was then a still unfinished library. And so, make sure my note cards are right here. And so this is just a photo of her from 1910 that is just one of my favorite photos. We just throw that in there. And so she begins working for J.P. Morgan in 1905, and we have this is his journal from 1905 where he's saying he's paying her $40, which I'm just like, oh my God, $40. Who lives on that? And then we have this great quote from Junius to his wife, Josephine, who knew Greene really well from her time on Princeton, had Greene over for dinner many a times. And he says, you know, he'd just gotten off the phone with her, and she's actually working up at the Lenox branch, packing up his collection, cataloging it, and having the time of her life. That is an early photo of what the library looks like. One of our curators in our printed books department told me this wonderful yet apocryphal story that when construction began on what is now known as the historic McKim Library, there was only one level in what is the East Room, which is the actual library, and that Belle Greene came, assessed his collection, and was just like, where do you think you're putting everything? And then the other additional 2 tiers of the library were constructed based off of her advice, going, your collection's big and you want it to keep growing, right? And so it's really interesting when you find yourself, because I'm gonna sure if you haven't been, you're all gonna come up to the Morgan Library and you go in the East Room. When you walk in, there's a giant fireplace and there's a huge Henry VIII, a tapestry that belongs to Henry VIII. And then you'll notice the bookcases on either side. Well, behind those bookcases right there are actually windows from the other side, because the windows had been constructed and then boarded up over with the bookcases that Belle Greene suggested in order to expand the collection. So from moment one, she was already like, listen, this is my library, I'm gonna tell you what to do with it. And JP just kind of went along with it. And so, I'm already off my cards, sorry. It usually happens to me. I just get talking and forget to look at them. So Belle Greene, when she was hired, and they actually moved into the Morgan, into what is the McKim Library, which is around 1907. That's when the stained glass windows go in. She works out of the North Room, which is that very far photo there. That is a staged photo. Her office was never that clean, which we know because of a quote, and she says that she has half the library on her desk. There is no photos that exist of Greene in the North Room, which is because she was a librarian who was just doing her job. She's like, why are you taking a photo of me? Like, I got a Gutenberg behind me. Like, let's take a picture of that. And so the only actual rendition of her in her actual job is this one by Otto Schneider from 1909, where we get the quote where she says that she has half the library on her desk. And then this is just for me because I absolutely adore it, is this card catalog cabinet. Now, all the furniture that was brought into the library in 1907 was custom made, but it wasn't ordered by J.P. Morgan. It was a combination effort between Belle Greene and Junius, who Junius, you know, he was a librarian of some sort. And so the two kind of got together and were like, what would be best for this collection? And so this is one of her card catalog cabinets, and it will be on display for the exhibition. There were 2 of these. They're like about my height. They're pretty big. Cabinets on either side of her office. And the best thing is they turn, which I'm just like, I've never seen a card cabinet that turns. That's incredible. And so, you know, it's just really, I mean, it's really ornately carved. And we just had a conservator come in the other day to look at it. And he's like, this wood is like really amazing. And started spouting wood facts that I was like, okay, cool. Like, but he said it was amazing, and I'm like, okay, cool. So she had really fancy library furniture that she worked out of the North Room with. And so how the historic library was set up is you had the North Room, which when you walk, how you would have walked in back in the early 1900s is you would have came in these 2 doors, and you would have been standing in this grand rotunda, and the first thing you see in front of you is the librarian's office, because she's gonna decide if you get in or not. And there's this wonderful story about like somebody sneaking a little business card into the door to the guard and her going, I guess they can come in. And so then on either side of her office was the West Room, which was Pierpont Morgan's office, where he famously in 1907 saved the U.S. economy by making sure that we didn't lose all our money, and locked people in to like solve the money problems, which I unfortunately do not know enough about finance to understand all of that, but led to a massive investigation by the US government and set up all these different trusts that we still have today. It is actually a really interesting story, and I recommend Jean Strauss's book on Morgan. She tells it in a lot better way than I do about that. And then on the other side is the East Room, which is that photo from the previous slide, which was the actual library of the Morgan. And so as Greene is developing in this position at the Morgan, she's done cataloging, so what is next? What does this mean? She really saw Morgan as a father figure. There's a really great letter to a gentleman who worked at the British Museum, Sidney Cockrell, right when Morgan passes away, and she's just like, I saw him as a father, a friend, a mentor. And so that has really been our basis for really kind of understanding her relationship with this man that is often referred to as kind of cold, kind of mean, kind of yelled at people. She kind of saw him as a big old softy, but they would just sit, play cards, have a drink of whiskey, and he would say, all right, let's talk about the collection. And they really did kind of work together, and he really did back her ambition for the library, which, take everything at what it's worth, we're talking the early 1900s, and she is a woman. And this man, with all of this money, is like, I'm gonna listen to her. And we just know through some of the letters in our collection that she was always really honest with Morgan, which is what we think he appreciated. She would say, yo, this dealer's trying to steal all your money. Don't go with this deal. Or like, this is, let me negotiate this down. And so you can kind of see how she gained his respect very early on by showing that she knew exactly, one, what he would want for the collection, by very much, when she cataloged it, she memorized it and knew what holes needed to be filled, what his interests were, and also by kind of appealing to any banker's heart, how do we save him money? And which is exactly what she did with one of her most famous acquisitions early on in her career, which is of the earliest surviving manuscript fragment of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And she actually is writing to Morgan in this letter in 1909 how she saved him the money. She argued it down to $1,500. But what's also great about her reflection of this acquisition is the fact where it's the first time we have her vision for what this collection can be when she says that she wants to make the library preeminent. Now, this is a private collection that is not, you can't just walk in the door and see it. But we do, between this letter and many others, we've been able to realize that, and through a guest book, that we were essentially, well, not public, we were allowing scholars to come in and work with the collection from the moment Belle Greene began to work for Pierpont Morgan. She was just like, this collection should be used, like, come on now. And so he'd have his people he wants to bring in and be like, show off his fancy jewels. But she was also allowing prominent researchers, scholars, to come in and work with these materials and to publish on them in order to get people to know that they were there. So it's kind of an early thinking of what could be next for this collection. And then we just have a couple other early acquisitions that she made for the Morgan during this time. This is Rembrandt's The 100 Guilder print. The Morgan does have the largest collection of Rembrandt prints in North America, and that is specifically tied to Belle Greene. Morgan had purchased a large lot of them in the late, around 1899, and when she got there, she assessed the collection, and she was like, all right, this one's not so good, we're gonna go after a different state, oh, we need this whole, and really, not being an art historian, figured out exactly what that collection needed, and this was one of those acquisitions she made. And then we also have on the other side it's called a Caxton Mirror of the World, and it's one of 17 that she purchased early on in her career. And so she's working, chilling with Morgan at the library, and then in 1911 is a sale that will put not only Morgan's name in the rare book world on the map, but her name as well. And that is the purchase of, and I always say it wrong, so I apologize, Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is essentially the tale of King Arthur. And she is one of only 2 women on the auction floor at this wholesale, it's the wholesale, in 1911, and she buys the book for $49,500, which is time, and it was kind of put out there, $50,000 for this book. It is not an interesting looking book. I'm a little bit afraid when it goes on exhibition for this show, because it just is words. But words are interesting. But, compared to some of her other acquisitions, it doesn't look that great. But she knew the value. William Caxton, the oldest English printer in England, and to have this is the only full surviving copy of this text in the world. And she was like, we gotta have it. And so again, one of only 2 women on the auction floor, outbid everyone. And there's this wonderful newspaper account that when she was bidding on it, that the plume of her hat, which in the Halleux drawing there is representative of the hat she was wearing at the sale, would wave as she was anxiously, bidding on it. And that after every sale after this one, people would fear her plume when she was on the auction floor. And so you see this article here where you see her bidding with the auctioneer, which has this weird beady eyes in the ad there. This put Belle da Costa Greene on the map, and immediately thousands of articles started appearing. Who is this woman handling all of J.P. Morgan's money? How is a woman being able to spend all this money? And every single article, of course, at the time, being written by a man, was she was wearing this, and this is what she looked like, and then got into the fact that she knew every single fact about a piece she was acquiring, because what they didn't know on the back end is we have thousands and thousands of cables where she was writing to scholars before a sale going, should I bid on this? Do you think, what is the history and provenance of this? Really digging into the facts. She would sit there behind the scenes being like, all right, British Library, what are you gonna bid on this? All right, let me, and then go back to the dealer. All right, British Library wants to bid this, I'm gonna bid this. Really wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. And she just knew how to maneuver that in a way, I'm like, I could never do that? Okay, cool. I wish I was that great. But so this, in 1911, this acquisition put her on the map, put J.P. Morgan on the map as well, though, as a rare book collector, and really made the world take notice that, the Morgan might actually have some really interesting materials that we should start paying attention to. And so these are just a couple more acquisitions that came around this time that actually speak to her curatorial practice. She was famous for she really liked manuscripts that were really scratched up. As you can see on the far left, that's a manuscript of Balzac's Eugénie Grandet. And I can't read that thing for the life of me. It really does look like that. It is a mess, but she loved seeing the creative process. And that is what she wanted to save. She's like, I don't want a fair copy. That's a print, everybody has that copy. I want to see how you got there. I want to know the inner workings of individuals. And so that's really the basis of a lot of our manuscript collection, comes from this really interesting place of why we collected what we collected. And you can also see here Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnet from the Portuguese, which you can see kind of the etchings. And then what's really interesting is very on and early in her career, we see her scholarship. So the actual manuscript of portraits of sonnets from the Portuguese is just that white paper. It was it's then put onto other paper and bound together, which was done with a lot of work. But you'll notice the notes on the brown paper. That is Belle Greene's handwriting, where she's comparing this original manuscript draft with the final copy and noting what was changed and how that creative process happened. Most Morgan materials that were acquired during Belle Greene's time have some kind of notations in them. Our illuminated manuscripts, you open them up, the first page is nothing, the front cover is nothing but her notes on the work. Yes, we know we're not supposed to write in books anymore, we don't do it, but it's really just fascinating how much interest she took in not just going, ooh, this is a really fancy book, let me acquire it. There was a lot of thought, a lot of rationale behind why we acquired what we acquired. It wasn't just to be like, ooh, look what we have. It was about how do we support, the scholarship and moving forward and really having the best of the best. So while she's at the Morgan, and I believe the book does touch on this, she entertains a lot of Morgan's guests, a lot of dignitaries, a lot of actresses. The actress Ellen Terry came through, but she will, most importantly, probably for her, bring through the library in 1909 Mary and Bernard Berenson. Bernard Berenson is a famous art historian, especially of Renaissance art, and it's during this meeting that Greene is very captivated by Berenson, and they start a relationship, and the letter there is her very first letter to Berenson that she writes in 1909. They will continue, they essentially have a romantic relationship for the first couple of years that they know each other, but they will carry on essentially a 40-plus year kind of pen pal relationship. He's in Italy, she's here. They only see each other about, oh, Lord. Oh, they just told me my time. I'm talking too long. Well, she meets Berenson. They have a wonderful friendship, and it's Berenson that really actually supports Greene in a lot of the endeavors that she's going to do at the Morgan Library, including introducing her to Persian manuscripts, which they will, there's a little catalog there where they will see a collection of works in Berlin together, and it's through their relationship that she begins to think outside of what just Morgan wants for the collection, but what she wants for the collection. And so non-Western materials were not at the height of the game at this time, and so he really she's just like, well, I really like this stuff, and I don't care that the Morgans don't like it. We're gonna start collecting it. And sure enough, she's like, I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to buy it. And so she does. And so we have some of these beautiful pieces in our collection. These are two more pieces that she has. And then in 1913, Pierpont Morgan will pass away. And she finds this loss really hard to contend with, but it also means that there's going to be a lot of changes to what does it mean for my career? What does it mean for my life? And so his son, Jack Morgan, which is there, takes control of the collection. We're still private at this time. Belle Greene gets to stay on as librarian, but together these two will make the decision to give Morgan's collection to the public and essentially become a public institution. And that's exactly what they do in 1924. Back. So in 1924, which is what we're celebrating this year, our centennial, we become a public institution, a public educational institution to the public, which means we develop a reading room, an exhibition space, and have to support our collections for public purposes. And it's really Greene who spearheads the development of all our rules and regulations that go in place. She now takes on the new title of not just librarian, but director of the Morgan Library, and she oversees the building of our annex, which is where our exhibition will be when it opens in October 2024. And this was our reading room. That was our exhibition space that she completely developed head to toe. Sometimes these things don't want to work. There. And so one of the things she really supported was the use of our collection for educational purposes. Our conservators don't like me saying this, but she would allow people to use our illuminated manuscripts as textbooks, which was actually such a big deal at the time that you see it was actually covered in a newspaper article. So she was really forward-thinking in how we did use our materials and our collection. She developed numerous relationships with people. These are just some letters, and I love this. You see her margins in her notes here. This is one of acquisitions she made that she continued to look kind of outside of the box of what we should collect and not just stick with traditional European models, even though this is still European. At the time, Spanish manuscripts were not well collected, and so she bought this. It's known as the Mathews. It's a manuscript on the apocalypse, and it's probably one of the best surviving, oldest Spanish manuscripts in North America today. This is just another really beautiful jeweled binding that she purchased. She continued to make major acquisitions during her time as director in all fields, from printed books to artwork. These are just a couple more. And so one of the really most interesting things about her time at the Morgan is she was probably one of the most well-paid women in America during her time here. That's one of her paychecks, which we did the math. It's around $240,000 a year. I always make the joke that if librarians got paid that today, well, whoof, we'd all be good. But it really was a testament to her fortitude. She fought for all of the other librarians and other staff at the Morgan to be paid. She went after everybody's salary at all other institutions in New York and made sure the Morgan paid higher than everybody else, because she really believed in the work she was doing and supporting the staff to have a functional way of life in order for them to love the collection the way she loved it. That wealth that she had from her job allowed her to become a collector in her own right. So these are actually pieces from her personal collection that were sold after she passed away. Lavinia Fontana, which is at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, actually all of these will be in our exhibition in October. But it really is kind of amazing. Again, here's a woman collector in the 1900s having the amount of wealth to be able to collect on her own. These are just two other pieces from her collection. She really was one of the first collectors to she had an interesting relationship. She hated modern art, but collected it, obviously, but wasn't quite sure what to make of all of it. She was an avid reader. These are some books from her personal collection and some of her book plates. She was also a huge lover of the opera. Not that surprising, considering her mother was a music teacher. And so one of her favorite plays was La Boheme, and she would